In recent times, between 100 and 300,000 people are deported from the United States. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the agency responsible for deporting people, deports these people because they undermine community safety. Now, we've heard a lot about people crossing the southern border illegally for work, other reasons, who are then caught and deported. I'm not talking about those folks. I'm talking about people who entered the United States legally, who fled war and violence in their countries of origin, who came here as refugees, who have been working and living in the United States legally for over 10 years, and sometimes decades before they're deported. I work with Somalia, but what I'm about to say applies to people from all over the world: Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, even Europe. When the United States deports somebody, they're working with U.S. law, and it makes sense. I get it. For an example, if somebody came over from Canada, committed a crime, got caught, went to jail, served his time, and upon release is deported, it makes sense. The positive consequences of deporting that person outweigh the negative collateral consequences of his deportation. It makes sense. I get it. But what if the negative collateral consequences of deporting somebody far outweigh the positive consequences? What if thousands of deportations of people from the United States creates communities across the United States, thousands of communities that are more unsafe than if that deportee had been allowed to stay in the United States? For those of us who travel internationally, we sometimes go to the United States Department of State website and look at the travel advisory for where we go. For Somalia and for many other countries, they're designated a do not travel country, the most dangerous country due to terrorism, piracy, kidnapping, torture, murder. Don't travel. But still we deport people to these countries. Fortunately, decades ago, the United States signed into law a UN convention, the Convention Against Torture. A provision in that convention stipulates that you can't deport a person to a country where they'll be tortured or where they fear they'll be tortured. As I said, I specialize in Somalia. I work with an ethnic group called the Somali Bantu. One subgroup of the Somali Bantu are the descendants of slaves from Southeast Africa, from Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique. People who were enslaved in the 19th century by the Sultanate of Zanzibar and brought to Somalia to work on plantations. For their entire history in Somalia, these Somali Bantu have been treated as slaves, as fugitive slaves, as second-class citizens, or worse. During the recent war in Somalia, all sides in Somalia suffered. People from the majority clans, the minority clans, marginalized groups, privileged groups, but the most consistent victims in the war were those Somali Bantu in southern Somalia, where most of the fighting occurred. So what happens when war breaks out in these countries? People flee to refugee camps. For Somalia, they fled to Yemen, to Ethiopia, and to Kenya, where I met them in 1992. The Somalis who belonged to the majority clans, the more privileged classes in Somalia, were allowed during colonial times and post-colonial times to study overseas, to work overseas, work in government positions, to accumulate wealth where people from their communities would be able to travel overseas and establish communities in the West, in the United States, Italy, Britain. These are called diaspora communities. So when these diaspora communities realized their family members in Somalia, their relatives, were now in refugee camps, the diaspora communities petitioned their governments to reunify their families, to bring those refugee relatives to the United States. And so we saw in the early to mid-1990s many Somalis coming to the United States, which is great. But for a marginalized group like the Somali Bantu, they had no diaspora community advocating for them, even though they were the most vulnerable group in the refugee camps and in Somalia. It took the United Nations, human rights organizations, and advocates 10 years to find a resettlement solution for the Somali Bantu. In 2002 to 2006, the Somali Bantu were granted resettlement to the United States and began arriving in this country. Now, Somalis don't come to the United States as criminals, at least the ones who were deported. The research we've done shows that most of them were in their early 20s, late teens when they committed their crimes. An overwhelming majority of the Somalis who came to the United States, majority clans and minority clans, are law-abiding. They came here, they learned English. They got their GEDs or their high school educations. Many went on to college, jobs, and they're productive members of society, paying taxes and living law-abiding lives. But because the Somali Bantu were in the refugee camps for such a long time, when they came to the refugee camps in Kenya, some of them were only 2 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old. Because they were in the refugee camps for 10 or 15 years, those people who came into the refugee camps as small children were adults by the time they came to the United States. Those people who came as very young to Kenya as refugees had their own families by this time. They had children who were infants or babies when they were being resettled in the United States. So what happens are these immigrant communities come to the United States. They have large families. The parents usually don't speak English, probably don't have a high school education. And so they have to find housing in neighborhoods that are low income, usually plagued by gangs and drugs. It's the only place they can afford. If you've got a family of 10, family of 8, and one income earner making minimum wage, that's what happens. So the refugees who come to the United States, the Somali Bantu refugees who came to the United States, if they were in their mid-teens, late teens, adults, they made it through those difficult neighborhoods. But the ones who came as babies, the ones who came as infants in 2002, they had to grow up in these difficult neighborhoods, these gang-plagued neighborhoods, these drug-infested neighborhoods. And they had to survive in the neighborhoods, in the schools, in the playgrounds, and they had to adapt to survive in this environment. Now, most of the Somali Bantu who came at that young age managed to get through school, graduate, and not fall into criminal behavior. But some of them did. In their late teens, early 20s, especially the boys, Some of them joined gangs. Some got caught for taking drugs. Some did more serious person-to-person crimes. But some of these boys who got in trouble, who got arrested in high school or right after, turned their lives around, married, became fathers, were working, raising families. But in the last administration, we saw that people with arrest records in the past were being rounded up, deported. Almost all the people who are deported to East Africa, and all the Somali Bantu deported to Somalia are young men. Probably 75% of them are married with children. So what happens? They serve their time. They get picked up by ICE. They're detained for months until their trial. If they lose in court, they're ordered deported. They're shackled in chains on the plane going to East Africa. Upon arrival in Mogadishu, maybe within hours, days, weeks, months, they're hunted down by criminal gangs, by corrupt police, even by Al-Shabaab, and they're kidnapped, and they're tortured for ransom. So let's look at the negative collateral consequences of deporting these deportee parents, these deportee fathers. Let's leave aside that these young men had to spend extra time in jail. The excruciating experience of being separated from their babies and their wives and their families in the United States. Let's leave aside the fact that they were hunted down in the streets of Mogadishu and Kismayo and other places by corrupt police, or that they were tortured by criminals. Let's leave that all aside. What are the negative collateral consequences of deporting that deportee father? For the family, instead of having another income earner, now what you have is somebody in Somalia or in East Africa who the mother has to send $50 or $100 every month just to keep him alive so he can pay rent and he can eat. So the family that was probably barely making it to begin with now has an additional burden of not having an income earner and has to pay money out. So these folks who were just above poverty they now seek deeper into poverty. And they're vulnerable to something we call the intergenerational cycle of poverty. How about the children? Children of absentee fathers suffer greatly. There's feelings of abandonment, poor school performance, drug use, mental health issues, more likely to join gangs, and engage in criminal behavior. The biggest predictor of future criminal behavior is if your parents were criminals. What these children of deportee fathers face themselves now is a future of intergenerational cycle of criminality. What does this mean for the states and the counties? What are the negative collateral consequences for the counties and states? Well, in addition to the human victims in our communities, because of this increased criminal activity, there's a financial cost on the counties and the states. Instead of those children of the deportee fathers getting educated, finding jobs, paying taxes, and being productive members of communities, those children are now in the criminal justice system. The last year I worked in the Oregon Department of Corrections. It cost $25,000 per year per person to house them in prison. What does this do to the United States nationally and internationally? When a family is forced to pay a ransom to save the life of their relative in Somalia, that $200, $500, $1,000 that can save somebody's life who's been kidnapped, that money goes into the pockets of criminal gangs, of corrupt police, even of terrorist organizations. Also, when the United States deports people to places where they're kidnapped and tortured for ransom, we lose a bit of our moral authority to insist that other countries practice human rights in their countries. Fortunately, researchers, academics, and some attorneys have been using the Convention Against Torture to prevent some Somali Bantu from being deported. But how about for those who are overseas, who are in Somalia, who, after being kidnapped, fled Somalia overland through al-Shabaab-held territory to reach the safety of Kenyan refugee camps? There is a remedy. We can bring those people back. We can repatriate them to the United States, to reunite them with their family members, to salvage what fatherhood they have left of their children's lives, to provide the discipline, to provide additional income, to have a father present in the lives of the children as they grow up and finish high school and become adults themselves. If these deportee fathers are allowed to come back to the United States and raise their families, even if 50% of the children who would otherwise have fallen into the criminal justice system are diverted from that and go on to finish high school and lead productive lives, even if 50% of those people don't engage in criminal behavior that victimizes our local communities, it will be worth it. Let's pass laws that make our communities safer and are humane all at the same time. Thank you.